Welcome everyone to today's social system mapping sense-making session for November 7th, 2022. And this is our final session of the year. So I'm glad you could join us. We are going to take December off. And I, for one, and I think Kara as well, are looking forward to a little less sessions for a month, just to sort of recuperate, and because we've been really busy and working hard, and so we're like, yes, time off. It's not fully time off, but kind of time off. So then we'll look forward to seeing you back again in January, those of you who rejoin us. So today, November 7th, 2022, your hosts are me, Christine Kepper, co-founder of Greater Than the Sum and sumApp, and Kara Martner, who is my partner in all kinds of productive things. And we're going to start off. Can you guys hear no, there's a what's the thing, you know, when they're digging up the street with a big machine that like, okay, it's right outside my window. So I'm glad I have a really good focus. Like, yes, Tom, what? Was that you? Okay.
Parrot.
You can?
Cannot.
Okay. What's that thing called?
Jackhammer.
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 Thank you. Jeez. Yes. Anyway, so for those of you who are not well, I have a confession to make, which is that I did not prepare for this session as minutely and detailed and having everything quite as set what's going to happen next as I usually do. I'm sort of doing this for a couple of reasons. One is I ran out of steam last week, and the other one is I would like to sort of approach this a little more organically, and so I'm learning how to let go of my scaffoldings a little bit. And so for those of you who are new to our community of practice, just to let you know what this is, I'm going to stop my screen sharing for a moment so you're not staring at that slide. Sorry. This is what happens when I let go of my scaffolding. My head goes, ooh, there's a whole lot of things. And I'm like, wait, what? So yes, for those of you who are new to this, what this is what we're doing here today is one small piece of a much larger vision. The vision being that social system mapping can help intentional communities become self-organizing and wiser and more effective more quickly than they would without a social system map. And so partly what we do when we're gathering is learn together about, so for people who are new to this practice, for instance, next week we have an on-ramp session, which will be, we always, the second Monday of every month, we always have an on-ramp session where someone in our community of practice who has created a social system map shares that map and talks through it. So if you're looking to see a map and understand the fundamentals of what it is, next week's session would be great. We do that. We dig in the third Monday of the month. We dig deeper into topics related to social system mapping. And for this session, now it's getting really loud. For this session, we look at sort of the underlying systems thinking theory that is applicable to social system mapping and is applicable to weaving networks overall. And so we are learning together, we are working to build a field together, we are sharing our adjacent experiences, expertise, and practices with each other. And so whether you're a mapper or interested in mapping, we invite you to be part of this community, however that makes sense to you as you learn more about it going forward. Okay, so the next thing I'm just going to whip through quickly is what is social system mapping for those of you who are not haven't been introduced to it in this format before. A social system map is a map. Oops. Time to go back and sharing my screen. Okay. So a social system map is essentially a mashup of a number of different kinds of visualizations related to communities of practice, change networks, etc., system change efforts. So it's partly a system map, partly a stakeholder map, partly an asset map, partly largely a social network map, partly a concept map. So it sort of takes all of these things and mashes them up together. And one of what all of these things have in common generally is there are dots and lines, or concepts connected to other concepts. So it's really looking at, in all of these maps, we're looking at the relationships between different things, whether they're systemic elements, people, concepts, etc. And we're looking at how they're connected to one another more than, I mean, we're looking at the nodes themselves, but we're also looking at the connections between them. So that's what all of these maps tend to have in common visually, is some kind of representation of relationship. But what's unique to a social system map is that it's much more dynamic. There's much more dimensions. It's kept up to date live. And so a social system map is inherently just way more complex than any of these kinds of maps on their own are. And that presents a set of challenges that we're going to talk a little bit about today. So it's also more of a process than a product. It's not like you just have this map and it's there and it's doing what it actually requires and invites ongoing reflection and iteration. It's online, it's interactive, it's accessible to all network members. Usually it doesn't have to be, and sometimes people don't do that, but that's part of the paradigm, is to make it accessible to everyone. And as I sort of alluded to, it's iterative, emergent, dynamic, and an ongoing collective practice. And the point of social system mapping is really about systemic transformation. I mean, that's the underlying motivation for creating this kind of mapping and developing the tool set and developing the methodology around it, is enabling more deeper and more rapid systemic transformation. So we're supporting a global movement, including, I'm assuming, all of you, that is working to shift from systems of dominance and exploitation and extraction to systems of connection and reverence and regeneration. There was a piece I thought I was going to say here, but I don't think I am. It's not coming. So one of the things that we've come to understand in the last 20 years, we meaning the broader field of system change, globally, and activists and theorists, etc., is that systemic transformation requires strong networks of wise change agents. So transformation is not a product or a project. It's not, can't be done from one particular organization or perspective or group. It requires multi-dimensional, multi-sector networks. And so if systemic transformation requires strong networks of wise change agents, what we've also discovered in the last few decades of doing this kind of thing is that we're not super experienced at that. We've been sort of indoctrinated not to work in networks and not to be wise change agents. And when we try, it is a huge struggle. I've been working exclusively with change networks for the last decade, and really going back my whole life in different kinds of contexts. And it's often really hard work. So a couple of reasons it's hard work is that it requires, in order for us to do this kind of work well, it requires a shift. There's basically two shifts that I like to talk about. One of which is the relational shift, which is a shift from understanding ourselves and acting out of a sense of separate self. So this sort of competitive, hoarding kind of self, and to more of an interbeing self, or more of a connected self. So there's this relational shift that has to do with how you and I relate to each other, how we relate to each other as a group, etc. Being together differently is one piece of this, of this, what's needed in order to work well in change networks, and in order to sort of create the kind of systemic change that these networks are aiming for. So A, relational shift, and B, a cognitive shift. So going from a mechanistic worldview where we sort of treat everything like you can flip a switch and it will work or not work, or if we just decide, once we've decided, everything's going to fall into place, where we have some sense of command and control, and think that we can just sort of force our will upon the world around us. That's also a thing we've been deeply indoctrinated into, and goes against reality and against it keeps us blind from understanding how complex adaptive systems, or how living systems, actually work. So we need to be unraveling our mechanistic worldview and learning much more about complex adaptive systems if we're going to do this kind of change work. So those are the two shifts that I like to talk about a lot, that are important for change networks to embrace and to actively work with. And we believe that a social system map helps us work at both of those levels at the same time, both the relational level and the cognitive level, at the same time, in the context of the work we're actually doing, in the context of the relationships that matter to us. And so it's relevant and meaningful and actionable while we're learning. So we're both learning and acting and doing and learning and etc. So that's the end of that thing I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and ask you to, having given that sort of introduction, let's have us go ahead and so one of the things of letting go of the scaffolds had to do with, I'm always a little bit like, we plan for breakouts or not breakouts. So we always want to do some breakouts because it's good to mix it up and for people to get connected to each other. And at the same time, we don't know how many people are going to show up. We don't know who's going to show up. So we don't quite know how to do that, like exactly how to structure the breakouts. And if I'm sort of feeling my way into this conversation, that adds to the unknown and to the last minute sort of figuring it out as we go. So, and I'll just say a thing. I've been coming to realize more and more lately that there's ways I do things and I don't explain why I'm doing them that way. And it can just look like I'm sort of being lazy or sloppy. And they are intentional, but I'm never clear about what the intention is. And so one of the things I'm trying to do here is I'm always practicing being willing to be uncomfortable. So I'm usually in an uncomfortable place because I put myself there on purpose, not entirely because I'm totally incompetent and just can't help it, but because I sort of go there intentionally. Another one is trying to be okay with not having all the answers and not being super polished. And the reason for that is not just because I'm either overworked or in a lazy mood, but because these are skills that we need to get good at, and we need to learn how to like stay present and move toward our purpose, etc., even in the midst of unknowns. And so I practice that a lot. And I also another intention is to learn out loud and be transparent. And so all of that is often going on at once, which sometimes makes me rather awkward. But I'm just voicing that's on purpose and why I think it's important to have those practices amongst lots of other practices. So having said that, I'm trying to decide about, let's go ahead and just first, let's have you do introductions in the chat. So for starters, let's have you put your, if you're willing and inclined, it's an invitation, not a command, to, in the chat, put your name, location, pronouns, any of those sort of very high level labels that help us recognize each other. Welcome, Eva. And Evan. These are the new names. Many of these names are very familiar. And John. John's in Berlin, and Evan's in Boston. And of course, Seth and Cindy, happy to see you. And Mary and Brian, happy to see you. I'm partly calling out some of the differences of engagement within our community. So there are some people here who are, I think I've maybe seen once or twice. And then there are people that I see all the time, some several times a week. And then there are people that I see pretty regularly. So just pointing that out, there's a mix of motivations and levels of engagement. Let's go ahead and put in to the chat a network that you, or networks that you are a part of, or working for, or with, or that are in mind as you think about this topic of social system mapping. Love KC for Tom and Charlotte. Anchor Gardens, which Cindy has been making a lovely social system map for a while. Mary has been very involved in this community. Brian has been very involved in this community, and the Donut Economics Coalition. Transportation Justice Organizations, nice. That's Evan. Central American Migration Justice. That's Seth. Early Childhood Network in East LA. So just IT climate. Climate, yeah. Just want to recognize that as we put our networks, share the networks that we're working with, it just points to all the ways that social system mapping can be applicable, but more than that, it points to the important work that social system mapping is trying to support, and the important systemic transformation kinds of topics and areas, the systems that the community that we're supporting is working on. So thank you for all of that hard work, and it's my sincere desire to be supportive of that work. So I'm going to share my screen again, and this is a Miro board. I use a lot of Miro boards because I guess I am kind of a visual thinker. I'm not really a visual thinker. I'm much more verbal, but I need to see the relationships between the verbal things, and that is a visual that requires being able to place them in different relations to each other. So anyway, I use Miro a lot. And what I wanted to talk with you about today is so I just talked about these shifts, and I talk about these shifts all the time. You know, I introduce social system mapping regularly, and I say, these are the shifts we're trying to make, and, you know, et cetera. And it's been kind of for a while, the challenge has been for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, all along, the challenge has been like explaining how these shifts actually happen using a social system map. And so I'm going to talk about that. So part of it, this is this, what I've been calling an explainer graphic, which Mary and Brian and a couple other members of our community and I and Sarah Raffo, a graphic designer, have been working on for a while. So I'm going to talk through that. Some of you have already heard this, but I'm going to hopefully add some more thought to it. And I also want to talk about the relationship between this explainer and system thinking, sort of writ large, any kind of system thinking, but explicitly in this context, human systems dynamics, which I think is a very useful framework for thinking about systems, human systems especially. And so how these two approaches complement each other and support each other. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, as a means of explaining how these two shifts actually could come about in our understanding of how social system mapping works in an ideal context. But I'm thinking that maybe let's do a 5-minute breakout. Kara, can we do that? Of threes? How many people do we have? Does that make sense? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And just, Kara, feel free to unmute and comment if you need to. Welcome, Katerina. I think you came in, and Danielle, since we started. Yeah, Kara, should we do it? Does 3 seem to fit?
Working it out here real quick.
Okay. And the prompt will be to introduce yourselves verbally, face to face, to a couple other people, and to talk about where you're, and to just identify the biggest questions that you have related to today's session and the two sort of big topics that I want to connect up, which is how human systems dynamics CDE model relates to the social system mapping process. So those are the two big high level things we're going to talk about. And if you could, and feel free to even like put them in post-its on, either put them in chat or put the questions you have in post-its sort of, let me show you where. Just stick them in post-its like right here. How about, I'll make a frame. Questions. Oops.
So we could have one group that would be a couple, or we could have 2 groups that would have 4 people in them. One group of 3.
Let's do the bigger than
Okay.
no 2s. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I not being able to make a frame? Oh, I see, because it's hiding. Whatever. Okay. So if you have questions, or if you would like to just put, this is just an invitation. It's not necessary, but questions you have about where this is going today, and that might help me.
And I'm all set if you're ready.
Okay.
Okay.
Cindy, wait, don't go yet.
Cool.
Hang on. Does anybody have any questions about what we're doing right now? Okay. Feel free to go ahead. Thanks. I hope you had some good conversation, and I just discovered that I gave you the wrong link, and so everybody had requested access, and I'm now giving everybody access. Well, let me do this differently. Sorry. I have okay. Kara, here's a different link for the board. Oh no, I can just put it in there. Everybody's got it. Okay. So I apologize for giving you a no access link. I think now you should all be able to get in to the Miro board. So you couldn't put questions. Apologies for that. And I was actually going to refer to those questions before I picked what I'm going to do next. I think I'm just going to go ahead and so I'm going to share my screen. And so there's basically these two high level areas that what I wanted to talk about was the relationships between these two areas. Can everyone see my screen? Is it okay? Okay. And so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to start down here with this one, and then there will be points when I come up to this one, and it will sort of be not super linear. None of this is linear. I mean, it'll be somewhat, but not completely. And so my invitation to you with all of this is that there, on the one level, this is, and it can be felt as an extremely complex, very lots of moving parts, lots of details, process and topic to have a conversation about. On the other hand, it needn't be overwhelming. You need not remember all the details. There's never going to be a test on this anyway. None of us have all of this in our brains at any one time. We, like right now, I'm sort of zoomed out. And so I'm saying, okay, yeah, there's this stuff. And then there's this stuff to talk about. I will zoom in to some parts of it. And I will zoom out again. And the invitation is to not make this a heavy process for yourself and not to make this overwhelming. When I think about the cognitive shifts is to let go of thinking that we ever can understand it all and that we must understand most of it or any large part of it, and to be okay with there being a lot of stuff that we don't get at this moment, and okay with letting there be stuff that other people can hold on to and you don't have to. And part of that, it has to do with also being okay with listening to your body and letting your body say, yeah, boring, 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 or I don't need to know that, I don't need to know that. And listening for when something shifts in your energy and you say, that's important, I need to attend to that. And maybe that thing I need to attend to is something that I need to share with the group. I need to tell other people that they've been ignoring it. Or maybe it's, I hadn't thought of that before. That's something surprising to me. And that's sort of my leading edge at the moment. So to trust that your own attention has purpose in it and knows where to go. And at first that might just be like relaxing it. And so I'm just inviting you to take that however makes sense to you. And acknowledging that sometimes I throw a lot out and sometimes that can be overwhelming for people. And I'm likely to get better at explaining what's going on, but I'm not likely to stop doing that. So I'm inviting us to all just take it lightly. So I'm going to start here with frame 14. Those of you who are in there and want to be somewhere and aren't looking at my screen, it's got sort of tealish green post-its below it. This is where we start with. So this is, I'm beginning sort of the explanation of the social system mapping process. And it starts with the fundamental assumption that there's some group of people who has some shared intention. So that intention could be just about anything, but it's if it has to do with making change in some way, then a social system map may be relevant to that. I'm going to pause here because I'm not sure. Are people oriented in the board, at least able to see where I'm looking, either from their own screens or from accessing the board directly? Seth, you're okay. Who else is? I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of you. Evan's okay. Okay, I think we're okay. I'm just seeing the cursors moving around and not certain if people are with me or not. And I don't want to be leaving that. And the thing is not that you have to be with me. The thing is, I don't want you to feel like you're being left behind or excluded because I'm not attending properly. So it's that's what I'm checking for. Okay, thanks, Michelle, for writing that in. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. I'm on frame 14. So we have this group of people. They have some intention for change. They're doing some stuff. They're coming together to accomplish some kind of systemic change, kind of a thing, something they want to be better. It could be small, it could be huge, it could be global, it could be, how the trash on my block is taken care of, that might be a little too temporal for a social system map, but at any rate, I'm trying to point out that the scale and the scope, this is applicable to a lot of different scales and scopes. I think the main thing would be that it's something that's an ongoing process. Although we do have social system maps that are made for specific events, but usually they're events of a group with a purpose. At any rate, people are coming together. They're using various convening methods such as liberating structures, art of hosting, all kinds of whatever methodologies for bringing people together and learning how to do shared decision making or whatever it is the goals are. That's happening, and relationships are getting built in this process, and things are being discussed and thought about. Then in frame 15, we have the point where, and if we're doing social system mapping, all of these things could have happened years ago, and we're bringing a social system map in now, or it could be a social system map as part of helping develop this. There isn't necessarily any particular point in the emergence of this group where a social system map, if it doesn't happen right here, it's not worth doing. It's like it could happen anywhere. But so in the emergence of this group or the development of this group, we've gone from talking and relationship building now to doing some projects together, taking some kind of action. Maybe they're, kind of political campaigns, projects, micro collaborations, different kinds of shared learning, mutual support, etc. So this is kind of often posited as the goal. Like, we're going to get together and we're going to build some relationships and then we're going to do some stuff. That's the goal. And what we, alluding to what I said earlier, are discovering is that there's often a lot of good intentions here. There might be some great relationships built here, but often once we start trying to do things, we discover that we're not always shifting the patterns as much as we would hope that we had. Often we start to discover that at the level of our own group, we're starting to recreate the status quo that we are hoping to shift, in spite of our good intentions, such as some people, have a kind of power that is dominating. Resources start to go to certain kinds of people. We start to have inequities, or we start to have interpersonal dynamics that don't align with that relational shift and or that cognitive shift. And that's because we're human beings and we've been trained in certain ways, and we've been indulging in these, not indulging, but being engaged and swept into these kinds of patterns for a very long time, and they don't go away overnight. So we have this action point where we start to discover, and whether we're discovering this consciously or unconsciously we might just say, oh, we're struggling, and not framing it in terms of, oh, we're reproducing the status quo. That's just my interpretation of what's happening. That's the words I'm putting on it at the moment. But so we get there and we start to see, okay, maybe we need to be thinking more deeply about what we're doing. Maybe we need to be starting to reflect and starting to have some deeper understanding. So at this point, the network needs something like more shared understanding, more coordination, more collective awareness of who's doing what. They might need to be doing more, in leadership jargon, getting up on the balcony or getting a bigger picture of what's going on, seeing how the parts are fitting together. So they'll start to need to have tools for reflection or processes for reflection, for stepping back together, for looking at things together. When they get to that point, now so that's over here in the explainer. So in frame 17, there's some people in the group might be a whole huge consensus process where everybody's involved. It might be, a core of people, but some people will start to do this sort of reflection on, how are we doing this? Are we doing this the way we want to do this? What else do we need to know, etc. And this reflection can be done sort of from our old mindset of mechanistic thinking, or it can be done from, if it's a small group, a core group, or a subgroup, it could be done from, one of the reasons it's the three of us is because we share the same worldviews and we share the same biases. And so it's easy for us to get along. And so we are doing more coordination, or we're trying to get a shared understanding, but we're still in our own mindsets, and we're not actually challenging those biases that we have. So we see this happen. I'm sure you've all experienced that in one way or another. And so I'm going to take a pause here from this social system mapping explainer graphic. I'm going to come back to this stuff, but I'm going to just come up to a way of, and this is where I started saying a while ago that the shift is not merely relational, but it's also cognitive, because we all have our mental models, and a big piece of shifting a system means to be able to get out of our own mental models, to take a step outside of our beliefs and our models, and look at the system from different perspectives, through different lenses, apply different models than the ones we're comfortable with, etc. And so this is the place where I've seen lots of social system maps where people I'm not here yet, but so they get some data, they make a map, and some people can access the map, but they don't really ever get to this. I'm pointing things out on my screen, so if you're not seeing where I'm sharing, you might be missing what I'm pointing to. But I'm in the black box. There's a big loop, and in some instances that's as far as it goes. And what I've discovered is that a social system map doesn't become very useful in that context if we're not taking this sort of middle reflection layer of the map and intentionally using different kinds of models and methods of understanding, of sort of helping us loosen our biases and helping us shift our mental maps. If we're not doing that, we're not really going to make a whole lot of significant change on the systems. We'll just spend a lot of energy and a lot of time, maybe build some great, wonderful relationships that do have potential down the road. And maybe we will make some small changes, temporarily, but the kind of change we're looking for is less likely to happen if we don't use some kind of reflection process that is intentionally helping us get out of our own biases. So this is why I think I love human systems dynamics. So I'm going up to the patterns and CDE frame, which is at the top of this board. And I'm going to talk through what this is the CDE model. So human systems dynamics was developed by Glenda Ouyang. She started working on it about 30 years ago. It's been relatively codified. It's been an institute for 20 years. And I find that Glenda she has three sisters. So there are these four women, and they were raised by teachers, and they're all teachers. And so they have a very good teaching. They're very good at teaching and thinking a lot about how to teach. And they have really broken down systems thinking in a way that makes it super accessible. It's still complex, but you can take a little teeny piece at a time and really start to use it to start to understand how the systems that you're engaged with work. And I really like it because I find a lot of systems thinking approaches. There's getting more that are more accessible, but for the most part are really abstract and hard to apply. And having just said that, I'm aware that right now I'm going to give you the most abstract and hard to apply piece of human systems dynamics, which is the container differences and exchanges model. And so this is from complex adaptive systems science. Complex adaptive system meaning a system that has so many variables and so many moving parts and is so dynamic that you can't predict it and you can't control it, and you can influence it, but you can never be certain exactly what's going to happen. And so when you have that kind of a system, you have to approach it differently than we're used to approaching systems. Like I said, we're used to flipping switches, or we're used to saying, okay, make it so, and thinking that we can control everything. And all of our human systems are complex adaptive systems, which means we have to handle them differently than how we're used to handling change. We're used to thinking of change as this very, mechanistic thing. And so from that perspective, how human systems dynamics frames this is that every complex system, there are 3 conditions that have to be in place for a system to be a complex adaptive system, and 3 conditions that you want to pay attention to. So one is the condition of the container, and the container up here, containers can be different groups. Containers can be organizations. They can be physical locations, like everybody in this hospital belongs in this container, or, this school is a container, this office building, this neighborhood is a container. But containers can also be things like values, like this group of people really values exercise, and so or jogging, and that's what makes them, they might have containers around an activity or a value. Different perspectives or different identities can make containers, and different and in networks, the most significant containers are things like the purpose of the network. What are the networks? What are the goals? And if that's not clear, then you have more trouble within your container, within your complex adaptive system. So you want to be thinking about the containers. What are the containers that we're dealing with, and are they fit for their purpose? Are they clear enough? Are they big enough? Are they small enough? Are they permeable enough? Are they too permeable? So that's the C part of the CDE model, the containers. And then within those containers, there has to be adequate difference. There has to be, in some, Brian often uses, what was it? Variety, not adequate. There's a different word. You can unmute.
Requisite?
Requisite, yeah. So requisite variety. So in other words, if you're dealing with a monoculture, like you've just got, a big field of corn, there's not enough difference. There's not enough different dynamics going on within the system for it to be adaptive. So it's very vulnerable and easy to, you can just introduce one kind of a pest or one kind of a disease and you can wipe the whole thing out. So part of requisite difference is having enough differences that things actually, there are adequate different things going on that can help the system adapt and be robust. That's maybe not the best way to say that, but we'll live with that for the moment. So differences can be, writ large, different, there's, all kinds of things, but what difference is in a network or in human systems, the distinctions between the people in the system that actually create the tensions, the creativity, the energy to change things. So if we're all, so corn, setting aside corn, if we're all basically the same kind of people with the exact same goals and the exact same needs, if we're pretty similar, we're likely to be pretty static as well. We're not likely to change a whole lot because we're just reaffirming our own beliefs. We're just reaffirming our own goals, etc. And there isn't a lot of, we'll be sort of stagnant. There isn't a lot of energy and tension around making change. So you want to pay attention to your differences. Sometimes you have so many differences that you in a container that's too big, you just end up with chaos. Sometimes you just end up with a real stagnant sort of status quo thing. And so you want to be paying attention to the differences. And those could be things like in a network, things like interests, things like differences in assets, different kinds of assets, different amounts of assets, different experience in network culture, because a network culture is different than an organizational culture. The way we deal with one another, the way we handle change, et cetera, is different. And for people who are brand new to it, it can be kind of weird. And for people who are really experienced with it, they have certain expectations that newer people don't necessarily conform to. Different motivations, different learning styles, different kinds of power, identities, skills, needs, et cetera. So all of these are the differences that within a container are going to impact the direction of systemic change and the speed of systemic change. So if we're trying to change something, this is another piece that we need to be paying close attention to. And then the last piece of the model is exchanges. So exchanges can be any kind of flow that's happening through the system. So these little lines are representing the exchanges. There's all different kinds of exchanges going on. They can be things like funding or things like friendship or skills. People are swapping skills, trust, bartering, whether for its material things or time or whatever, collaborations, working together, relationship, language, connection. So these are the kinds of things that are often being exchanged in networks. And so that's the CDE model. This is the sort of highest, Glenda calls this a high level abstraction, because you can look at complex adaptive systems of any size, from the planet, the universe, down to, a seed in a piece of, in some dirt, or a cell in your body. And you can identify that in all those cases, there are containers, there are differences, and there are exchanges. There are things exchanging within the container, and then there's things exchanging from inside and outside the container. If you don't have all of that, it's probably not alive. That might be too big a statement, but so that's the CDE model. That's the sort of the fundamental. And Glenda says, you could almost treat it like math. Like if you want the container to be the right size for the differences, the exchanges to be the right exchanges for the difference. So like you might say, make this part bigger, this part smaller. And we're looking at all three of these conditions across a spectrum from finite to infinity. So is the container how finite, how big, how many different kinds of exchanges, et cetera. And so the understanding of complex adaptive systems is that, so you have this CDE, this system here that's going on here, and you have these exchanges that are going across the system, and so you have, these are agents, the agents are interacting. As they interact, there become patterns of interaction, interactions or flows that get repeated. And the more they get repeated, then the clearer a pattern they've created. And so over time, you have this system-wide patterns that have emerged. And so this is part of why I said, down in the gathering place of the explainer graphic, we come together, but we're all bringing our patterns. We're bringing the patterns we've grown up with. We're bringing the patterns that we're used to in our interactions. And so right off the bat, if we're not sort of finding ways of shifting them, there's a certain degree of recreating the status quo in our patterns. So agents interact, they create these system-wide patterns, and then these system-wide patterns influence future interactions. So the fact that I'm talking a lot, as an example, and haven't stopped for input or breakouts or anything like that, that's a pattern. And sometimes that pattern is an appropriate pattern, and sometimes it's a pattern that if we repeat it over and over again without thinking about it, then what we do is we make this kind of dominance or this kind of exclusion, this kind of repression of agency, etc. So that being aware of the patterns at all these different levels is a piece of systemic change. because if we don't change the patterns down here, then we're just going to repeat them. But when we do change the patterns, then that can, when we do that in a repeated way, that it takes, or it starts to spread the patterns of interaction, then that changes the system, and then those influence future patterns. Okay, I think you guys all probably know that, but I wanted to spell out, I mean, I'm certain you know the patterns, you know, the changing of patterns and status quo. I wanted to sort of spell out the contents of what we're looking at, which was the CDE model, because I'm going to go back now to, I'm going to pause. Is any, so like I said, I'm continually pushing myself to do this differently. And I should have maybe said in the beginning that well, let's just see if anyone has anything that feels like it really feels important or strong, whether it's a question or a comment or a concern, to voice that right now. I want to just open up for a couple minutes just to hear where you're at before I go back to me talking. Seth.
Yeah, thanks. I was introduced to the CDE thing once before in one of these sessions, and both in that time and this time, I found it to be really promising and useful, though I'm still struggling to grok it completely. And so this time, one of the things that occurred to me as you were going through the examples, I just want to like share this, either it's an insight or a question. As you were going through the examples on the Post-it notes of, say, you know, examples of containers and examples of differences, the pink Post-its and the green Post-its, that in some cases these are contextual, depending upon the nature of the system that we're talking about. So, you know, like you were having, you know, in this presentation, you know, goals are an example of container and skills are an example of differences, but they could be inverted. So if you had a system of chess players, you know, their skills are one of the things that defines the container in which they exist, but they might have different goals. Some might be about teaching and some might be about competitiveness or whatever. And so you know, what constitutes differences and what constitutes the unifying container is contextually based upon this, whatever it is we're talking about. And that probably applies as well to the exchanges to some degree as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's part of, so there is no, so the invitation to hold this lightly is sometimes people, you know, I can see them tying their brains up in knots, trying to figure out, is this a container or is this a difference? And it's like, depends on how you want to look at it. Depends on what you're trying to do right now. It depends on the context. It depends on what you're trying to understand in this moment. And so let it be loose and just know that whatever, in any moment you've got something you're trying to understand, and you can use, just do, you know, just use the framework to sort of guide your thinking, but it's not rigid. There are no rights and wrongs. And it's just a way of helping you think. One other thing what you brought up made me want to say is that the reason I like the containers and the differences and exchanges model is it is abstract, and it is, so it can be more confusing, but it fits in any context. And often we'll be taking a framework or an approach from one context and trying to apply it in another context where actually some major components of the C or the D or the E are so different that framework doesn't really fit. But we want to say, you know, we say, well, this piece of it was valuable to me, which is why I'm trying to apply it over here, but I need to tweak it. And the C and the D and the E can help us think about, okay, what do we tweak and what don't we tweak? So since it's so abstract and applicable in all different kinds of contexts. It can help us structure our thinking in a way that we don't just have to say, throw that whole thing out and start from scratch, but make the appropriate changes, or we can, once we've identified the C, the D, and the E for our context, it gives us ways of thinking that we wouldn't have if we're looking at what's already been developed, other frameworks that have already been developed that are more specific to specific contexts. Anyone else have another comment they want to make before we move on? Don't feel like you have to. I'll be. Okay.
Christine, I just put in the chat
Oh,
the idea of looking for energy. And I'm considering that in the other groups that I'm working with. If we're trying to find out where the energy comes from the exchanges, correct?
The energy comes, so this is a good question. The energy, I mean, the more I think I'm just extrapolating here. I haven't thought exactly the way you're asking, but generally we say that the energy comes from difference. It's from creative tension. So if like, so here's an example. Tim and I live together, we work together, we go for our walks together. We share a whole lot in common. So there's a whole lot of sameness between Tim and I, even though there's also significant difference, but and we have exchanges all day, every day. They don't necessarily give us energy because they're not introducing something new to the system. They're not, until we have a task that requires us to use our differences. But my point being, frequency of exchange does not necessarily create energy. It could even create exhaustion. It's the difference that creates a new perspective, a new possibility, a problem to solve, and that's where the energy theoretically comes from. Yeah. So as Michelle's saying, find the difference that makes a difference. So it's not, and that's a really good point. Michelle, do you want to speak to that a little bit? But Cindy, does that help as a starter? I just want to.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah. What I've heard Glenda say is to find the difference that makes a difference. So for example, I worked with one community action team and they were all from the school district. So they all had the same resources and assets and know-how to bring to the table. So it was hard for them to find something that they can do together that they couldn't already do within their own organization. So that's one example. So when you have partners from different organizations, for example, they might have different assets or resources and know-how and that's the difference that matters in this particular case. So in every case, it might be different to what is the difference that makes a difference. So it could be people coming from different containers or people wanting to communicate differently or something else. Maybe there's a difference in opinion that sparks another project. So it really depends on the case by case basis, but you're always trying to find the difference that makes a difference or where there's a lot of energy.
Yeah. And I'll just throw out another piece of this is there was a time when I firmly felt like you just need a lot of differences. Just throw some more differences in there. That's important. Difference matters, etc. And then I heard somebody quoting Glenda, because Glenda lives in my community, close to my community as well. So a lot of us change makers know her. And I remember hearing somebody say, yeah, well, Glenda says that sometimes there's too many differences. And if there's too much difference, then you need to reduce the difference. And I was like, I don't buy that. I think that's a bunch of baloney. And that was, a decade ago. Since then, I have come to see the wisdom of that, the too much difference, especially depending on the size of the container. If the container is big enough and the exchanges are constrained enough, you can have a whole lot of difference, but often too much difference, too tightly held with too many exchanges becomes kind of like Twitter, or kind of, it can be, it just creates chaos, or a lot of, there's so much heat or so much tension that can be created that it's destructive. So, so thanks for bringing that up, Michelle. That was helpful. That we're looking for the difference that makes a difference, not just any difference, not just random difference, not just the usual suspect of difference, which in the United States lately, the biggest difference is often race, which is like the usual suspect of difference, which in certain contexts is definitely the difference that makes a difference, but not in every context. And so what is the difference in this context that makes a difference? Thanks for that, Michelle. Anything else? Is anything coming up for anyone else that wants to say something before I sort of wrap up the explainer graphic? Okay. I'm not seeing faces looking like they're prepared. They're looking for their mute button, or they're preparing to vocalize. So I'm going to move forward. I'm going to share my screen again. So here's the sort of the general sense idea of with social system mapping. If you're looking at my screen, I'm sort of zoomed out a little bit, looking at frame 17. We can do this reflective stuff sort of reflexively, in other words, without a whole lot of self-examination or looking at our mental models, etc. We can do that, or we can start to add more rigor or more discipline to, applying frameworks and thinking through the framework to see if this is helpful and to see if this helps us think about it differently. We can do more engaging with the different perspectives, really hearing from other worldviews, etc. It's often very helpful to have some kind of a structured framing, scaffolding kind of a thing to help guide those discussions or those explorations, so that they, as they start to surface the energy or surface the tensions and the differences, that they're held in a way that makes them more likely to become generative and less likely to become destructive. So that's the point of having frameworks. That's the point of using systems thinking, is to help us uncover those places where there's potential and move into them without causing damage. And so when we get to that point, in the context of a social of an action network, an intentional change network, we start to say, okay, I'm on frame 18. We're doing action, we're building relationships, we're starting to reflect and think more about how we're working and coordination, etc. This is also deepening relationships. Those of us who are working on this and talking about this are getting to know each other much better. So we're still building relationships, and now we're starting to try to break out of our own norms and our own mental models, and we're starting to reflect. And in the context of a network, if it's a small network, this reflection you can use, there's all kinds of ways of looking at this, from asset maps, power landscapes, system maps, stakeholder maps. There's lots of different kinds of maps that can help with that. And using a map, using any kind of visualization is super helpful, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can say a lot more visually than you can verbally. You also visuals interact with a different part of our brain. So our brains there's more parts of our brains going on when we're both looking at intent at a meaning or a symbolism or whatever, as well as talking about it. So our cognition kicks in differently and better when we have some visuals, and we can talk about it better. It's easier to talk about complex things when we can point. We can say this node and that node, and no, it should be above, it should be below, etc. These kind of just pointing at symbols and having shared symbols where we've agreed on what each symbol means is super helpful in creating shared understanding. So as we get to this, we're starting to reflect, we're starting to want more, ways of visualizing what we're coming up with, because it is more complex and we need these additional supports for that. And when we get to, a certain size of a network, there's the problem that no one can know most of it. There's what we call a network horizon. There's, I'm aware of 20 people doing stuff, but the network is 50 people big. I can't quite see who's working with who and what's going on there. And that's where a social system map comes in. That's where when we're at that place where we understand that we need to be looking at the patterns and the dynamics and understanding the patterns of the exchanges better and the patterns of the differences better, then a social system map is super useful and can help. If we have that and we use it wisely as intended, then we start to have that relational shift and that cognitive shift start to happen collectively. There's a couple, I just want to talk about these darker frames. And just to say, this graphic, this explainer graphic is still in development. This is not the final draft, but the general gist of it is in place. And so I felt free to use it, but so we're still sort of working it out. But the idea is that we can start, I'm on the full explainer frame now with the dark background, and we can often in networks that I'm working with, we have people doing stuff on the ground. So these are sort of what I call the touch points or entry points into what's going on with the network. And then someone, often in my professional work, is it might be one or two people decide what questions to put in a social system map. They decide they want to have a social system map. We design a survey and we start to gather data. So the data goes from the people right up to the social system map. We make the map, and then the assumption is that then the people will use the map. And so we have a level of use of map we call a directory view. They can use it just to find each other. And in some contexts, that really works really well, and people have a sense of, oh, I want to find somebody who is like this or who is like that, and I want to reach out, and they will do that. The more evolved the network is, and the more the sense people have in the network that they are part of a larger ecosystem, the better that works. But if you don't have this sort of central reflective activity going on where we're using our social system map to do exploration about the patterns, to generate collective insight, to be harvesting discoveries, do action planning, et cetera. If we're not finding ways of really engaging the map with the activities of the community, which requires this sort of intervening behavior, which can be some people in the community, it can be lots of people in the community, it can be one person, but someone's got to sort of facilitate this shared thinking of how this map, how well it's reflecting what's going on the ground, what else might be needed to be shown in the survey, how we can use it, SenseMake with it, et cetera. Without this middle piece, a map is not really generally going to go very far. And it might do exactly what it was intended. So for instance, we used to, in the beginning, most of our client work was for one particular foundation who would do these big events. And we would do a social system map for this big event, and we would share it at the event. And it wouldn't really get used after that. But the point of the map for that context was they just wanted to help people start to think of themselves as a network, to start to see that they're not alone, and to start to see that there are all these different leaders in this area with interests, et cetera. So it was just sort of a shifting in thinking that they were trying to accomplish, and it did that. I was never satisfied with that because it felt really superficial and like we could be getting a lot more out of it, but that's all they wanted, and that's what they got, and they were happy with that. So that can work, and that can be just fine, and it can be appropriate perfectly appropriate. I'm not saying it's not appropriate just because I wasn't satisfied with it. Then we can also, I just put that in there accidentally. But in an ideal social system mapping context, what we would do is we would be finding ways of weaving the map and changing the map, adding different questions, adding new questions, asking people to go back and give more data, weaving that into this reflective process more and more and more, so that we're sort of bringing the generation of the data and the ability to look at the data closer and closer, more tightly in with using things like the CDE model, with using things like looking for what's really going on, where's the energy, where are the differences, where's the potential, what's possible. And so that's this sort of most mature, most ideal stage of how a social system map, if we're using it that way, sort of wrapping it into much of what we do, and using it to inform much of what we do, and using what we do to inform changes to the map. When we're using it that way, that's the whole idea of how a social system map can help us get to these shifts, and how HSD fits into that really nicely. I'm gonna stop, and Seth, do you want to say your? So I'm gonna give us like 5 minutes to chat, and then we'll start to wrap up. And Seth, you have a comment about the middle.
Well, no, I was just going to say, when you were describing the role of that middle piece, that sounds like the role of network weaving. Consciously reflecting on and looking at the network and seeing how it can be better reflective of the community, how more connections can be facilitated or enabled, and how it can, have greater resilience and definition. It sounds like that's a major role of network weaving.
Yes, and I think part of the distinction that is being made here in this graphic is that really network weaving is going on at all, like it's going on down here as well, often, and in lots of contexts. I mean, I've spent years in contexts where, all we do is close triangles, and we think that randomly closing triangles is going to get us somewhere. And it might, depending on who's there and all the other things, but often we need more intentional reflection and really understanding patterns. And so, for instance, so I often think of network weaving as like the core of it being closing triangles, and that is a pattern that we need to shift. So that is about one valuable pattern shift. And the idea is that if we have something like a social system map and a reflective practice, we can add more patterns that need to shift and amplify that. And Cindy, I'm just, Cindy, do you want to verbalize what you were saying there? I know it was in response to what Seth was saying. So.
Yeah, I'm working with a group, and they are waiting for the self-organization to happen. And if you wait for self-organization, then you're looking for energy. So where's the energy coming for self-organization? If it just doesn't show up, then the leaders have to do it. And that's sapping energy. Yeah. So my latest thought is maybe the reflection process is where the energy comes from. Yeah. You just have to make sure that you pull in the right people for the reflection process.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good example of the need for the reflection process. Does anybody, so let's just see if there's anyone. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see, especially for those of you who have not been with us or not frequently with us, or for whom this is all just kind of different and weird. If there are those of you here, just want to hear if there's any, any burning questions or thoughts or concerns that you would like to share and potentially have a little bit of a mini conversation about. In other words, just making space for those of you who are new. If Evan.
I'll hop in. Hi, I'm Evan, Boston area. As a new person, I feel mostly that I need to like do more reading or orienting myself to some of the kind of conceptual theoretical framework that we're talking about. Like a lot of things feel familiar, but with different labels or names.
Mhm.
And so that I feel like I need to find some type of like foundational text or websites or videos that are like help me wrap my head around the terminology and concepts. So that's how I'm feeling. But otherwise, nice to see that this is like a formal-ish community that comes and talks about this and has frameworks to use for moving forward.
Can you say a little bit more about the terminology that feels like I got this sense that there's pieces of it that feel familiar, even though the words don't fit. And I'm wondering how important the words fitting, like what piece feels to you like, oh, I need, like, what's underneath the need for more clarity around terminology or theory?
I think that, so one example is like closing triangles and network weaving. Those feel like terminology or jargon, but they make sense. And if you had asked me before I stepped in here, I probably could have used other words to describe those concepts. So I like that there's actual words that are intuitive and are connected with this larger conversation. And feel like what I'm missing is why do I feel like I need something centralizing and organizing? Maybe it's in part to be able to fully participate and know what everything means and connect the dots coherently. Like I appreciate the kind of energy metaphors about like potential and flows and difference and things like that. Like there's this whole something tangible to actually grasp on that helps use words that are connected to each other and phrases that everyone else uses. And so I think that's mostly what I'm feeling. And like having the right book on, social systems mapping that's like, yep, here's how all those words fit together it feels like what I need.
Thanks, that's helpful. Are there similar thoughts or tangential thoughts that any of the other new people?
I just want to tag on, Christine, that there's a whole video library of all these meetings, and some of the older ones are more simplistic, I think, than these ones. As somebody that never read a book, I just have to go through and find all the sessions and listen to them. And you can do that when you're, cleaning the cat litter. So it's something that you can do on your off time.
Thanks, Cindy. So we just have a couple minutes. Anyone else, anyone who hasn't spoken or doesn't usually speak in these contexts?
Just appreciated the role of the intervening in the other system map. It just showed patterns, but didn't show how the patterns changed or more effectiveness than that the newer picture you're building and the social system map had that intervention role in there, which I found very helpful.
Great. Cool. Anyone else? Yes, Michelle, Introduction to Network Weaving, I think Evan was probably the book that would help, given the jargon that wasn't already familiar to you. That all comes from June Holly's work. Probably, I'm probably a lot of it comes from June Holly's work. Well, I just want to, so I'm going to wait one more second in case one of you was getting ready to say something. Mary, your mouth is moving. I think you're maybe speaking, but you're muted.
Sorry. I assume you're going to put the link to the community of practice map in. I know
Yeah.
there were some new people working on specific things that it would be good to be able to send them more resources around what they're interested in if we had their email address.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That was gonna be part of my 1 minute quick wrap up.
I thought so, but I thought I'd just check in case.
So there's a link in the chat about putting yourself on our community of practice map, which is one way into being part of this community. And I just want to thank you all for putting up with my letting go of my scaffolds, and I wasn't too uncomfortable. I feel like I maybe yammered a little bit too much, but I was calmer and less sped up than I usually am. And I felt a little more able to pivot and to be present. So from my perspective, that worked. If you have feedback for me and you want to send it to me or throw it in the chat or whatever. But it's at the bottom of the hour, and I'm like to respect people's time. And thank you, Michelle. And we have a goodbye ritual. I think closing is important, and so we'll do it really quickly, which is we all unmute our microphones. I'll count down to 3, 2, 1 if you want to do this, and then we're just going to all give each other our greetings and blessings for the day and ready to jump off. So if you're going to play this closing ritual game with us, please, you can even keep coughing if you need to. And and I'm going to go through, so if you're not unmuted and you want to just jump in quickly, do or not, but ready. So 3, 2, 1. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Awesome day.
Hope you have a wonderful week.
Okay, love to everyone.
Bye.